Continuing our Lenten series on how Jesus saves, today we are at Jesus and Atonement, the last scapegoat, REDUX, which pairs up with the fourth Sunday in Lent last year. And today we look at Girardian theory of atonement, which is probably the least well-known approach, as whilst I think the raw parts of the theory are very biblical and theologically insightful, the picture of what those parts add up to was only fully drawn together in the 20th century through the work of René Girard, hence Girardian atonement. And he clarified his theory over about 30 books, so I can only focus on one part of it, which relates to the ancient practice of scapegoating. So, a reminder, in case you aren't fully familiar with the Hebrew scriptures, scapegoating was a core religious practice in temple-era Judaism. So, as described in the 16th chapter of Leviticus, it's a cracking read, the high priest on the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, shall take 2 goats and present them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He is to cast lots for the goats, one lot for the Lord and the other for the scapegoat. And the high priest shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. But the goat chosen by Lot as a scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. So the high priest asks God to take all of the communal sin and wrongdoing of the people and transfer it to the scapegoat and send it out into the wilderness away from the people. Probably doesn't need to be pointed out, but the goat is actually quite innocent. The goat has nothing to do with the sin of the people, but rather becomes the accepted and even divinely appointed channel through which that sin is cast out. And that all may sound very unusual to us. But ritualizing the inner need to scapegoat is quite brilliant. And seriously, I put it to you that at a societal level, even an individual level, we engage in scapegoating all the time. And the people in Jesus' time did it too. So look at the gospel reading from today and you'll see what I mean. Jesus highlights 2 awful events. One is some Galileans who were killed in a terrible way, which was also deeply defiling for Jewish people. And another, the Tower of Siloam in Jerusalem collapsed and killed 18 people. And reading into the text, it seems like people were searching for meaning in these events in order to find someone to blame. They wanted someone to blame. If the tower fell on these people, well, they must have done something to deserve it. Or maybe it's because of some particular quality or trait that we don't like. And the Galileans, well, who likes Galileans anyway? They're just northern folks who are schismatic and sinful. They wanted to blame the victims. But that avoids the deeper problems though, such as a violent, occupying force, and for the tower, perhaps just dodgy engineering and building practices, or being built on a poor foundation in the first place. And just after these stories, we get a very confusing parable that's quite hard to understand. But it could mean something like this. This man had the fig tree planted, but it wasn't tended to properly, ever. The man was angry that there was no fruit after 3 years, even though fig trees take a few years to start fruiting. And the gardener points out that the conditions for that tree needed more attention to enable it to thrive. It might not be the tree's fault. It's that there are other conditions, soil conditions, the maturity of the tree, the climate, the attention of the workers, and so forth. But the tree itself becomes the scapegoat and a target for that owner's dissatisfaction, however unreasonable that may be. And as I said, this sort of thing happens all the time, even today. So some examples. Back in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina caused significant death and damage in the US, a prominent pastor said that gay people were to blame for the disaster, which was a sign of God's judgment. They were to blame for the hurricane. After 9/11 in the States, a very prominent pastor said this is God's judgment because of pagans, feminists, and gay people. Now, you know who had absolutely nothing to do with Hurricane Katrina and 9/11? Gay people. Nothing to do with it. But there is the scapegoating. Another example. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, part of which meant that Germany was made to take full moral blame for the war and commit to economically crushing reparations to fix up a broken Europe. And in time, Adolf came along and tapped into a couple of decades worth of national shame and poverty and stirred up a national zealotry and found someone to blame for all the woes that the country had faced. So he tapped into nearly 2,000 years of general Christian anti-Semitism, 500 years of German Lutheran church anti-Semitism stemming from Martin Luther, brilliant reformer, awful anti-Semite, and centuries of anti-Semitic tropes like Jewish people drinking the blood of Christian babies, amongst other things. And he thus ended up presiding over a genocide, the Holocaust. And you know who had nothing to do with the woes of post-World War I Germany? Jewish people. So fast forward to our time. Do you remember very early on in the pandemic when there were reports of places like Chinese restaurants suffering boycotts because of misplaced fear and prejudice about the origins of COVID-19? Now, it was about that time I found my now favourite local Chinese, which is Eureka Street Barbecue in Wilson. This isn't sponsored by them in any way, but it is my favourite. Because you know who had absolutely nothing to do with the outbreak of the global pandemic? Ordinary Chinese Australian people like the owner and staff of Eureka Street Barbecue in Wilson. True.
What was the name of that restaurant?
Eureka Street Barbecue. But you see, for scapegoating to work, it relies on people not understanding what is driving them. It thrives on the dark recesses of our subconscious, which harbour our prejudices. And we all have them. We've all got them. But it then stews them in fear, and suspicion, and anger. It relies on us finding relief in taking the problem out on someone else, because the real sources of the problems are too far removed or too complicated. So I hope that helps illustrate the problem which Girardian theory seeks to address. But we are concerned with salvation in this Lent series and how Jesus saves us in relation to this. And there are a few things to say about that. First, Jesus is just so sensible when he's diffusing the problem which is posed through the murder of the Galileans and the collapse of the tower. He's just so sensible. And that sensibility comes down to bad things happen. And that is that. Bad things happen. People can be caught in bad things through absolutely no fault of their own. Second, simply by having a level of awareness in relation to scapegoating, understanding its history, its function in religion and society, the mechanisms it relies on to work within us, and the harm that can be done through that. The simple fact of being aware of it helps. It's like Jesus has shone a light on this part of human history, on this part of the human psyche, and exposed it. And through shining a light on it, the darkness has lost ground. And last point on that, liberating us from or saving us from the hidden dark operation of scapegoating necessarily means that our concerns become directed towards the victims of the practice. Our concern is shifted towards victims. And even acknowledging the incidents in modern history, which I mentioned, I think it is fair to say that never, ever, at any other point in history, has there been such a widespread concern for victims as a group. Never, at any other point in history. Roman emperors would put up huge reliefs celebrating their conquests and enslavements. You don't see that now, generally. So that point relates to last week's sermon on moral influence. But think about it. On balance, people care about victims, whether of natural disaster or war or injustice or oppression, at least far more than in Jesus' time. So the kingdom of God which Jesus preached, which overturns and critiques so much of our worldly values, has filtered through our society, and it's changed things. Being concerned for victims has been a transformative moral and spiritual shift for humanity, especially as Jesus helped broaden compassion for victims from beyond our immediate circle, our immediate family, to our neighbour, that expanding circle. And who does Jesus say that our neighbour is? So this is, like last week, a this world, kingdom on earth sided approach to the question of how Jesus saves. And like last week, if you're left thinking, but there's so much more to do, there are always victims. Absolutely. So, like last week, take responsibility for the presence of Jesus in our world. Take responsibility for the presence of Jesus in our world. That is our calling as baptised Christians. Called, blessed, fed, commissioned, and sent out in the power of the Spirit for Christ and his kingdom. The Lord be with you. Amen.